My name is Trey Grayson. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics here at the Harvard Kennedy School. We want to welcome everybody to tonight's John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. Tonight we're going to talk about two things we should never talk about in polite company: religion and politics. Last night when I was talking with my 8-year-old daughter about tonight, she said, what's the topic going to be? And I said, religion and politics. And she said, what do they have to do with one another? I'm like, well, come to the forum, you'll learn. So we're really excited about the topic tonight. There are a lot, those two terms have a lot to do with one another. And we've got a great panel tonight to talk about this. Our panel tonight is going to be moderated by Anna. Anna's not actually going to be moderating the panel. Lori Goodstein is moderating the panel. She's the religion correspondent for the New York Times. And fortunately for us, she was coming to Boston to do a college tour with her son, who I will not embarrass by pointing out that he's in the front row. But we're really excited to have her. We were calling her anyway, and it turned out it was perfect timing. So we're really excited to have her tonight, and she's going to introduce the rest of the panel.
Okay,
thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So, election 2012 was supposed to be about the economy. Remember that? Jobs, the deficit. Remember where our heads are supposed to be at. But a funny thing happened on the way to the Iowa caucuses. Religion is once again a factor, and religion is a factor in very surprising ways this time. We have a Mormon frontrunner who is winning the Catholic vote. We have not one, but two Catholic challengers, Rick Santorum and Newt Gingrich, who are turning off Catholics, but are being held aloft by evangelicals. And in a country where, if you think about it, every recent presidential inauguration, the president has mentioned in their address an appreciation for Americans of every faith, including Americans of no faith. So in a country that is that attentive to faith, religious freedom, and whether it's threatened in this country, is also a front burner issue. So if you have seen some of the photography from primaries and seen people who are attending these primaries, you'll see people holding signs that says, "Obama, leave my religion alone." So these are all very surprising, appearances of religion in this political primary process. So what is going on here? So we have a wonderful panel tonight to help us analyze this and explain some of the twists and turns. From my left, Governor Ted Strickland is currently at the Institute of Politics as a resident fellow. He's the former governor of Ohio, 6-term congressman. Before politics, he received a Master's of Divinity from Asbury Theological Seminary and served as an ordained Methodist minister. So you are doubly qualified to be with us tonight. Charles Stith, to his left, is currently the director of the African Presidential Archives and Research Center at Boston University. Before this, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Tanzania. He's also served on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and he was a senior minister at the Union United Methodist Church in Boston. So
this is the Methodist corner.
Qualified, yeah, we have. We probably should do religious identities here. Is that fair? I don't know. Anna Greenberg is a leading pollster and an expert in survey research methodology with nearly 15 years of experience. She's currently Senior Vice President at Greenberg Quinlan Rossner, a premier research and strategic consulting firm. And she's been doing polling that is right on point to what we're talking about tonight. Richard Parker is a lecturer in public policy and senior fellow at the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. He was co-founder of Mother Jones and currently is the chair of the editorial board of The Nation magazine. So welcome to a great panel. And I thought to get started, a very open-ended question, but for each of you, about what has surprised you most about the appearance, the infusion of religion in this primary process this year. Who wants to start with that? Well,
okay. I'll start off. Two things. I mean, on the political side, the thing that has surprised me is that, as you mentioned in your intro, given the focus that we thought we were going to have on the economy, that fundamentalist religious values have taken center stage to the extent that they have surprised me. And also because I don't think that's a winning formula, which I found surprising. On the religious side, the thing that surprised me about the way this is unfolded is that there's been this focus on Christian fundamentalism and almost no discussion about Mormonism. And given that Romney is a bishop in the Mormon church, has been historically very active, and with this focus on faith and values, politics and policy, I've been surprised that that hasn't been more of a point of focus. And then finally, I've been struck by the fact that the more liberal wing of the Protestant connection hasn't weighed in at all on some of these issues that have been framed in very, very divisive ways.
All right. We're going to talk more about that, I think, right?
Well, I mean, I agree with all the points that were made. I mean, I thought that there would be a much more robust discussion of Romney's faith than there has been. We've done a little bit of experimental research that looks at the impact of him being a Mormon, and it's just like when Obama was running for president, it was very hard to measure how his race affected people's inclination to vote for him, because people aren't going to say to a pollster, I don't want to vote for a black candidate for president. Similarly, it's hard, it's not as, we don't have the same kinds of issues around someone being a Mormon, but it's still, people don't want to say, oh, I wouldn't vote for someone because they're a Mormon. And with some experimental work we've done, it does have an impact in the Republican primary electorate to some degree, and I think that is part of why, there's lots of reasons why I think evangelicals in the Republican primary are not that supportive of Romney, but I think that is still part of it, even if there isn't an open discussion about it. The thing that has surprised me is not so much the way religion is sort of present, because we have a very competitive and active Republican primary. And one of the most important groups within the Republican primary electorate are evangelical Christians who are driven by a particular set of issues. And I am, though, surprised that Santorum is doing as well as he is. What I'm surprised about is the issue of contraception and a whole range of women's health issues and how prominent those issues have become. They have been really active since the Republican sweep in 2010, in Congress and also at the state level. And even though there have been 900 anti-abortion laws introduced across the country, it's still been relatively under the radar. And the way it is so it's been going on, whether it's contraception or abortion or Planned Parenthood or Title X, there's been a lot of activity on the right. But it seemed to have just exploded and now won't go away. And it's not just because the press is covering it, it's because of the things that people, Romney talks about defunding Planned Parenthood. You've got Governor Corbett in Pennsylvania saying that if women don't like the invasive ultrasound, they don't have to look at it. So, I mean, they're fueling it. And, as someone who works as a Democratic pollster, it's not particularly helpful for the general election. It may be helpful in the primary, but it's not particularly helpful in the general election.
We're going to get into that a little more.
I'd echo some of what both the speakers have said. I think that the presence of religion in this cycle is a function of Mitt Romney's inability to knock off the other candidates early. Secondly, the fact that the Republicans have allowed there to be too many debates. And third, the desperation of the press for issues to hang the election on, and ultimately for Romney's competitors to find wedge issues to drive against Romney. I agree with the ambassador. I'm surprised that Mormonism hasn't come up, but I think Anna recognizes that it is a little difficult to play an openly Mormon card any more than one plays an openly Catholic card the way that was played in the primaries in the Democratic Party in 1960, for example. But it's perverse because in this cycle, we're now almost 15 years away from what I think of as the tail end of the last big upsurge of religious conservatism in America. In the 20th century, there were three big surges, in the 1920s, in the 1950s, and then in the 1980s and 90s. And the moral majority went bankrupt 20 years ago. The Christian Coalition has been dead for 15 years. Ralph Reed is peddling Indian casinos along with Jack Abramoff rather than working for the holiness of the American spirit. And so we're in an echo period from that upsurge. And so to find the Republicans caught on the back end of this cycle in this particular way speaks to me more about the difficulties of the Republican Party generally looking forward than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for me, it's not a surprise as much as a disappointment that that in this time, religion has become so polarizing and is being used politically in such a divisive way. As I guess a liberal Democrat, I would like to think of maybe this being the death rattle of the cultural conservatives trying desperately one last time to hold on to something that no longer exists, and to think that we're talking about contraception when the problems that face this country are as severe as they are is nearly unbelievable. And I don't say that euphemistically. It is nearly unbelievable to think that we could be talking about contraception, that we could be talking about whether or not a woman would be subjected to an invasive procedure that I think she would have to pay for. And then to have a governor say she doesn't have to look at the ultrasound. It's almost as if we're seeing a deterioration of our political discourse in a way that is, well, maybe I am surprised, but I am also disappointed that this is happening.
So talk about why this is happening. When I started at the New York Times in 1997, and as a religion writer, one of the first stories I did was about the implosion of the Christian Coalition,
right.
Because that organization in those years that Ralph Reed and Pat Robertson had built, that was powerful enough to put voter guides on the seats of every pew, every megachurch in the country, at least conservative megachurch, really had a tremendous reach, and then just kind of dissolved. And I wrote this story about the end of the Christian Coalition, but I also remember questioning whether that meant it was the end of the religious right or the culture wars. So why do you think it hasn't gone away? And also, I mean, is this really the death knell, or are we seeing something different? Is this with us, to stay? Are we going to be living with this?
I think it's important to distinguish between a voting base that has strong faith beliefs that then attach themselves to political issues and institutions that intermediate between the electoral system and those voters. And what you were coming in on was the tail end of these a powerful series of these institutions that had mobilized this bloc in a way that allowed them to describe themselves as a religiously organized bloc. But those groups the economics of them weren't sustainable. They were constantly overexpanding. I think I remember some of your early reporting was on Christian Coalition misrepresentations of the number of pamphlets distributed, boxes of pamphlets found in dumpsters outside of Christian Coalition offices, and all the rest. And that's exactly what had been going on a decade earlier with the moral majority, that the press didn't have the capacity to check a lot of the claims. The leaders of these groups knew that, and so they would make claims about the extent of their influence that was far beyond their actual reach. That didn't mean that there wasn't an angry, mobilized voting base. But the fact of the matter was that most of the issues that were pushed by that voting bloc on Republican presidents, whether it was Reagan or the first George Bush, didn't come to fruition. They didn't get what they wanted on issues of abortion. They didn't get what they wanted on a whole host of what I think of as the body issues, which always are about women's bodies, not men's bodies, but let's not go there. But they didn't get them, and so a combination of the inability to deliver what was promised, plus mismanagement would be the kindest word for it, caused those organizations to implode. So what you're getting, I think, is echoes out of the voting base that the candidates are trying to tap into as wedges right now in the primary to gain some leg on Mitt Romney. How successful they are, we'll see.
I mean, religious divisions are still incredibly important when it comes to organizing campaigns and targeting voters. And I mean, one of the things that the Bush campaign did, especially in 2004, amazingly well, was micro-target religious voters through the use of big consumer databases, but also getting church rolls and adding them to their databases. And so, you know, when we do these modeling exercises, we actually want to know something about whether it's their denomination or their level of religiosity, because that helps us figure out who we should target and not target, and that's really not going away. Even if organizationally the Christian right is sort of, it's an echo. I do think, though, there's a cultural relevance issue here. I am struck, another thing that I'm surprised about is how little LGBT issues are a part of this conversation. We have 4 states that are going to have marriage amendments on the ballot: Washington, Minnesota, Maine, and North Carolina. And those will be, I think, get a lot of attention as we get closer to Election Day. But there is silence coming out of the Republican primary relative to abortion and contraception. And I just think it's because culturally this country is shifting so fast on these issues that I think that even as they're trying to play to base voters, they know that dealing with LGBT issues is a non-starter in the general election. So there's a relevance issue too, I think, for these social issues.
Are these like Prop 8 measures,
Yes.
like we saw in California?
Well, yeah. Well,
so
in some states they are to overturn what the legislature has passed. In other cases, it's to actually introduce, like in North Carolina, at its level of statute, it's already illegal for gay people to get married. Now they want to put it in the Constitution. So it's different. It's slightly different in each state. But.
Yeah, but I'd use another word. We've used surprised, disappointed. I want to throw in perplexed. Up until the 2008 cycle, and I give money, Governor. But I decided once I became older than the president, it was time for me to probably retire into some other capacities in terms of electoral politics. But having been fairly intimately involved in presidential politics since Carter, I was ready to buy the conventional wisdom that the Republican Party was so hell-bent on getting rid of President Obama that they would swallow about anything, which was also part of the I think, the raison d'etre of the Romney campaign. And for the life of me, I just don't understand. Now, maybe the pollster can help me with this. You know, I can't understand for the life of me why these guys have zeroed in on these kind of wedge issues, which, you know, I heard the point about kind of micro-targeting certain constituencies in order to get over the hump. But they've got to appreciate that this stuff is toxic going into the general election. And the governor and I were talking backstage that from the perspective of the Obama campaign, man, you couldn't have written this script any better.
My only comment would be that, you know, this is the primaries, and they can't compete in the general unless they win the primary. Yeah. And the truism that the press carried around at this point last year was evangelicals are going to be very tough to line up on Romney, and the evidence now is that's not true. The evangelicals are split in interesting ways. A third of evangelicals appear to be voting for Romney, roughly, in a number of these primaries. There are exceptions. And so you realize that these voters are perfectly capable of being tactical voters as well as being committed to their sense of values. I learned that back in the '88 race when Pat Robertson decided he wanted to be president and ended up spending $15 million and got one vote at the Republican convention because his voting base wasn't going to vote for Pat Roberts because they knew Pat Roberts would never be elected president. So you have to remember that we're in the midst of a primary right now, and the spread between these guys is very close in a lot of these states, surprisingly closer than anybody has thought. Romney keeps holding on to a polling advantage. He's lost it a couple of times, but he seems to be up right now. But they got to close the deal, and they haven't closed the deal.
I get primary politics.
Okay.
I get primary politics. But in every cycle, we've seen, particularly with front runners or people who are really in play, we've seen them historically find at least one hook on which to hang their hat that gives them some tacking room back toward the center. With Clinton, it was the Sister Soldier moment. You know, they've always found a way to say, okay, I've got to play to my base, but I'm prepared to come back toward the center in order to put myself in a position to be elected. And just when you think you might see somebody tack back toward the center, they go further right.
Their base is further away from the center than the Democratic base
Well,
is.
I was
That's
asking,
the-
I was going to ask that. What does this say about the Republican Party today? Has it moved?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
It has.
Well, I mean, part of what happened in 2010 in particular was that so many moderate, to the extent that there were any left, moderate Republicans got primaried by Tea Party candidates, that you lost you had a couple of things happen. I mean, you had a lot of Republicans lose in the Northeast and other places that really were blue areas of the country, just as you saw that kind of adjustment in the 90s in the South. But you also had a lot of moderates get primaried. I mean, I'm sure that's why Snow decided not to run for re-election in Maine. And so institutionally, you don't have a base of pragmatic, moderate Republicans in the leadership of the party. And even someone like John Boehner, who's very conservative and gets it, has very little operating room in Congress. So I think that there's a problem with a kind of party that's out of power, that's moved farther right, both at the level of the voter, but also institutionally, and nobody has a lot of control over it. They don't have a president who sort of has control over it. And it
Or
leads
state party operations that
right,
control.
right. A lot of it fell apart after Bush, left office. A lot of the infrastructure that Rove created sort of went away. McCain didn't really have the infrastructure that Bush did when he ran for president.
And the Tea Party, let's talk a little bit about the Tea Party and the role of the Tea Party. And the Tea Party was characterized as primarily, about the economy and
Absolutely.
taxes and all that. What are we learning about this, about who the Tea Party is, or the Venn diagram that is the Tea Party and the religious right? What's the best way to describe what's going on?
Well, I think the Tea Party perhaps started out as focusing on the economy, but that seems to have changed rather dramatically, and it seems as if the Tea Party has been taken over by the religious right. I don't see any really difference between those who say they're Tea Party advocates and those who consider themselves evangelical, people who are concerned about these moral issues. And I'm perplexed too. I've moved from disappointed to perplexed because I thought that Romney would emerge as the stable, thoughtful, mature business leader who would present a serious challenge to the president. And now he's saying, even if the Congress were to pass, for example, the DREAM Act, which applies to children who were brought here as children through no fault of their own, he says, I would veto it. And so, I see him trying to go to the right of Newt Gingrich, and it's a race to the right. But my question is, where are the traditional Republicans, the more moderate? Are they out there, or have they just disappeared?
Well, they don't participate in Republican primaries anymore. They call themselves independents. I mean, there's been the composition of the primary electorate has changed over time.
Where will they go in the fall?
Well, I mean, up until the last 2 months, independents were breaking for Romney. But both the combination of, I think, the economy getting better, which has helped Obama, just lifted him generally and improved his performance among independents. I do think the Republican primary overall has not been helpful with independent voters. And some of it, a good deal, has to do with the social issue, because the social issue piece of it, because independents tend to be economically conservative and socially moderate. I don't say liberal, but more moderate. And so these independent voters are perplexed, like, why are we having this conversation? And so as Romney moves farther to the right, pushed there by Santorum and Gingrich, he alienates independent voters. Now, I think there's plenty of time for them to come back to Romney if he can shut this thing down. But independents are now sort of evenly split between Romney and Obama.
Yeah, and I think that's another consideration, which is the paying attention issue. I was just looking at some Pew data on people paying attention to this whole Catholic bishops' contraception being paid for by insurance issue. Only about a third of the country says that they're paying much attention at all. I mean, a third says they've heard about it. A third, amazingly, not from this room, I suppose, have said they've heard nothing about it. So
Really? Oh, that's very interesting. Well,
they probably don't read the Times.
but
Maury, that's- yeah.
Once we
They're
get
not
into
reading
the
my
general
work.
cycle,
Exactly.
They are. Oh, yes, they are.
When that issue emerged, it was framed very intentionally, very differently. It was framed that this is not about contraception, This is about religious freedom. The Catholic bishop said that the issue everybody here is familiar with this issue, right? That the new HHS rules, Health and Human Services rules for the new health program, require that even religious institutions like Catholic hospitals or Catholic universities would be required to have insurance plans that cover contraception. And so the Catholic bishop said, you're violating our religious freedom. And they had, right out of the block said, we have allies on this. Our allies are, conservative Christian colleges. In fact, there's been, I think now, 7 or 9 lawsuits filed against this requirement. And a number of the lawsuits are by evangelical colleges, not Catholic colleges. You have also Orthodox Jewish, allies on this. So the bishop said it's not even about Catholic teaching, it's not about contraception, it's about religious freedom. But very, very quickly, the framing of the issue did shift from religious freedom to it's about the right to, have birth control paid for. How did that happen? And is there any way in which that religious freedom issue is alive for, a section of voters? Does it matter to some?
I think the Catholic
people?
bishops have been very savvy and they're getting good media advice, because anything that talks about the Catholic Church and sexuality is not what they want to have talked about in public right now, whether it's women or men. So framing this as a religious freedom issue, I just appreciate as a tactical maneuver by them to be very shrewd, because talking about sexuality is not something the church is in a position to talk about. What I find so interesting is that, when you frame it as a religious liberty question, you still get Catholics pretty evenly divided on the question of whether they support the church or not. And again, religious liberty issues are kind of reflexively, oh yeah, I support that, usually. So when you have this kind of split, it tells me that the Catholic Church leadership is having, again, real difficulty bringing its base along, and that's probably the most important thing to watch as we move forward into the general. Not so much Catholics who voted in Republican primaries, but Catholics who will vote in the general.
But don't you think the shift from religious freedom to contraception came from Rick Santorum primarily? And then, he talked very openly about...
He's had that issue for a decade.
Well, but I think
that's old
the
territory.
issue is that, as I said earlier, 2010... kind of Republican wave at both the federal level and state level. A lot of elected officials came in. Issues of reproductive rights, whether it was abortion or contraception or sex education or Title X, these were very important issues. They've been fighting very hard on it and having a lot of success in the states where there's complete Republican control of the state house and the legislature, less success in Congress because of the Senate being controlled by Democrats. So even though the Catholic Church wants this to be an issue of religious freedom, the people who agree with them want this to be about reproductive rights. Yeah, right. And so when you have an advisor for Rick Santorum say you should have a bare, aspirin, between your legs, and the things that, Santorum has said, they basically just took it away from the Catholic Church attempt to frame it, because the people who carry it are not they're not interested in it as a religious freedom issue. The other issue is that your average voter doesn't think it's a religious freedom. They don't think it's an issue of religious freedom. And I was mentioning earlier that I've did some polling on this for Planned Parenthood last week. And when you talk about, in particular, this rule under the Affordable Care Act, and you ask about coverage of birth control, about 55% of people support it. When you add the religious compromise, that not just the compromise that ultimately came out of it, but the one that's in there, that was already in there, support goes down 5 points. You still have majority support. And it's because you can't convince Republicans that Democrats are going to do anything around protecting religious freedom, so you don't get any points with them. And your pro-choice and progressive voters don't like the religious exemption, so you actually lose ground when you start talking about the religious exemption on at least coverage of birth control.
I still can't believe that what we're discussing here is birth control and not the Mormon Church. I was all geared up to be doing stories about, Mormon theology and, Mitt Romney having served as a Mormon bishop, and what does that mean? And it's almost as though that has vanished. Why is it? And is it possible to unpack it all? I mean, Anna talked a little bit about how hard it is to tweeze out why, in particular evangelical voters, might not vote for Mitt Romney? Is it that he's not sufficiently conservative, or is it his, is it his church affiliation? But what do you think is going on? Are there any indications that it's not an issue because it's not an issue for people? That it's really not, they're not bothered by this?
I think it depends on who your surrogates are, because as a candidate, it's very dangerous to sort of pick up. If you're a Catholic Newt Gingrich, you don't want to be the one who picks up the religion issue for fear that you're going to get whacked back on some level, because there still is, in some southern states particularly, a potential anti-Catholic vote. So you don't want to be stirring up those waters too easily. So that then puts you in the position of relying on surrogates. And I think I'll tell you a story. I teach a course on religion politics, and I had a very bright Harvard Law student 5 years ago who came to me at the end of the term and said, I want to write my paper on a hypothetical Mormon running for the presidency and how he would hypothetically address hypothetical evangelical voters. And I said, well, hypothetically, I'd be delighted to see the paper. So instead of a 15-page paper, he gave me a 65-page memo about how to do this. And what the memo said was, stay on issues, don't discuss religion. Stay on issues, don't discuss religion. Well, he was hired by a non-hypothetical Mormon candidate.
I knew you were going there.
a few weeks after he finished the course. And I think that Romney early on understood he needed to stay on issues, stay off religion, stay on issues, and then let's see whether the others would dare to take him on. And they didn't.
Well, when a majority of the people in Mississippi say that Barack Obama is a Muslim,
Right.
I think that says something about the cross currents that we're seeing in this electorate.
I mean, I think some of it is particular to Romney. He's really, in some ways, overexposed. People are he ran for president in 2008. He was the governor of Massachusetts, the Olympics, and he's very familiar. And he doesn't scare people. And I think that if we had a different candidate who was, Huntsman probably doesn't scare people either, but if it had been somebody different, it might be a different story right now. But he's very comforting. People, people who don't, even though he has net negative ratings, when I do focus groups and people talk about him, they talk about him being honest, a businessman. They think that he's kind of upstanding. He's a family man. The fact that he was is or was a bishop and has tithed 10%, they actually think speaks well of him. So that his background actually gives him standing for, I don't do focus groups with Republican primary voters, but with, independent and swing voters. And it's other things that bother him, like whether or not he's, consistent and, switching, with the wind, depending on where he's running. And those are the things that concern about Romney. But the fact that he's a Mormon actually provides some evidence that he has good values and is a family man.
It'd be interesting to drill down on this a little bit. And the reason that I say that is because, again, going back to Carter in '76, every candidate who has won the presidency had an issue around which they were vulnerable. For Carter, it was being from the South. And the way and he had to address it. I mean, you couldn't play like the 800-pound gorilla wasn't on the couch. And it was because of Coretta, Scott King, Jesse Hill, Andy Young, and that crowd that had civil rights credentials and bona fides that said, he's a Southerner, he's a peanut farmer, but he's our guy. With Clinton, it was some other issues, and with Obama, it was race. With Obama, it was race. The thing that everybody dreaded was something like Reverend Wright, but that really is the thing that inoculated him on that issue. And I think that the fact that there hasn't been more of a discussion about Mormonism within the context of this electoral cycle is going to be the thing that will lead to Romney's undoing if it's not taken head on.
Well,
but if you bring up the concept of multiple wives, then immediately it swings to Gingrich, not to Romney. So, you know, well, how do you...
Maybe that's how he inoculates.
There we go. There you go.
I think that's true. I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah. Well, the most, I think the most incisive thing I've heard about Mitt Romney's church affiliation came from Richard Land, who is with the Southern Baptist Convention, and he's kind of a political player in Washington. He's a lobbyist, but he said that the problem with Mitt Romney is not that he's a Mormon. It's for conservative evangelicals' point of view. It's not that he's a Mormon. It's that he is not sufficiently Mormon. Because if he were, he would be more conservative, especially on morality issues, more consistently conservative. So this has been a great discussion. We know that a lot of people here have come with questions, so we want to give people an opportunity to ask those questions. There are, two? There's a microphone here, one there, one there. Oh, good, that helps. Having the lights up, one there. And if people want to line up behind the microphones, when it's your turn at the microphone, if you can introduce yourself or just say your name. And please make sure you ask a question and not give us a speech, because if you do, I will get in your way. So, and let us know who you'd like to direct the question to as well.
I'm Charlie Clements from the Carr Center here, and my question is to any of the panelists, but do you think that in the general election, the issue that, it might have been that same gentleman from the Baptist Convention, I don't remember who it was, but somebody said, my problem with him is not that he's a Mormon, it's that he's not Christian, because they're kind of trying to really separate Christianity from Mormonism, which seems like it could be a pretty divisive issue. So does anybody think that that's going to surface as an issue?
Cool, let's take that.
Well, Richard Land, I don't think made that statement.
He
It
did
would
not,
not have.
no.
I know Richard. We served on the commission together.
That's right.
But Reverend Franklin Graham has made such a statement. And this goes back to my point that unless this issue is taken, confronted head on, it becomes a subtext, and because it's never addressed, you can't calculate the full impact until Election Day. Of course, it's too late then.
Right, I mean, I think that when he, because I still believe that Mitt Romney will be the nominee, we don't know what kind of conversation there's going to be about the fact that he's a Mormon. And right now people are, talking about this primary, and you've got a lot of interesting things that happened around all the candidates that has been a distraction from that conversation potentially. But once Romney is the nominee, if he is the nominee, it doesn't mean, we may still have that discussion. And to your point, if we haven't, it may be, if the conversation is not productive for him, it may be happening too late in the cycle. It may be a problem.
But the issue is there'll be a choice between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, and I think that will cause a lot of folks to lay aside concerns they may have about the fact that Romney's
the unspoken
a Mormon.
race issue versus the
Yes.
unspoken
Yes.
Mormon
Mormon
issue.
issue,
Yeah,
right.
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 See, I don't think that it's so much a problem for Obama that the Mormon issue is unspoken, because it's an issue that affects voters that are predisposed to vote for a Republican candidate, and it only moves in Obama's direction in terms of holding down a
It does
Republican
affect voter
vote for...
enthusiasm, though, and
Well, I think
turnout has
that's,
been down,
yeah,
and if you look at
6
the
to 8%,
turnout,
right?
and all these Republican private turnout has been down, and so it may, impact
It may be affecting the turnout, yeah.
Oh, all the turnouts are down.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. All right.
I'm Robert Nichols, and I'm not sure who to address it to. I know Richard too well, so maybe I'll throw it open. But it's the question of Christian values. We've talked about religion in politics, but the sense of values doesn't seem to have come up anywhere. The sense that of what happens to the poor, the visiting of the prisoners, of all sorts of things that one might think of at least as Christian values. I shouldn't say religious values. And I wonder if anybody would care to say
So
whether
this
there's
is
a
the
place
missing
there.
mainline voter right here, Laurie.
Right.
This
Yes,
is
that's
that
right.
other
Yeah.
Protestant tradition that these two gentlemen are such
I guess
worthy
what I'd like to say about that
representatives
is, what are Christian values, and who is the spokesperson for Christian values? Because my values and the values of a lot of people who may identify themselves as evangelical Christians may be very different when it comes to something like food stamps or funding for education or a whole range of
taxation.
yeah, taxation and so on and so forth. So I think it's really difficult to, I think we can talk about values, but to talk about Christian values, I think is not terribly helpful, because there are so many differences that exist within the Christian tradition, the Christian faith, and maybe humanistic values are easier to define than even Christian values.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I also think part of the issue is that the denominations that are most likely to advance that version of Christian values are the ones that are declining, just in pure numbers terms. Mainline Protestantism is on the decline. And also institutionally, they're weaker. They don't have the same kind of membership. They don't have the same kind of, they don't have the weekly or more than weekly church attenders. They don't have the same kind of institutional strength. So that voice is harder to be expressed, I think, in our politics. Moreover, you have a bias against politics in church in mainline Protestant churches that you don't have in evangelical churches. So that, the pastor speaking from the pulpit about a political issue is much less likely to happen in a mainline Protestant church than in an evangelical church. So I just think there's a big institutional problem for kind of progressive religious values in American politics.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a good question. All right, let's go.
Atul Singh, I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. It's a new publication, and hopefully we'll one day rival The Economist. So,
What is
Good
it
luck.
Fair Observer. The idea is to get analysis from around the world, not just one country. So my question is, and this is key for a foreigner like me, is in the UK, which is where I studied and lived, Tony Blair had to hide his faith. It's only after he left office he could declare that I'm converting to Catholicism. And he was a closet Catholic, everyone knew that. The question here is, why does every candidate have to appear to be religious, whether Democrat or Republican in the US? Everyone, including Barack Obama. Why is it still the case?
So I teach a semester-long course in that, and if you have time, some of the students here would be glad to, I think some of my students are here would be glad to talk to you. I don't think that's answerable in under several minutes.
Can you try?
But it goes to the history of America. And
tradition.
This was a country founded as an idea, and a lot of those ideas were fed by people who came with religion as part of the markers of their identity, and partly as what their hope was for what America could become. And so religion has always played an important part in the life of American politics. Tocqueville wrote extensive parts of Democracy in America discussing the role of religion in American public life. European religious institutions went into the decline in the early 19th century in the aftermath of the French Revolution, took a series of blows after that as a consequence in Catholic countries of the syllabus of errors, in Protestant countries through industrial. There's a whole different story here in which religion plays a proxy for class, it plays as a proxy for ethnic group, plays as a proxy for occupation, so that religion plays a much more important role in the United States than it does in virtually any other industrialized Western country. It's the way it is.
And I would add, and I mean to pick up on this historical theme, we lament this kind of turn toward fundamentalism that we're seeing expressed now. But Christianity has had some very bright and shining moments within the context of the American experiment in terms of driving it. The abolition movement was driven by the church. The civil rights movement was driven by the church. And these are good things. And I think that we've had more shining moments than dark hours. I think the other things about this kind of institutional and cultural rootage of the church in this country has continued to punctuate the importance of religion and politics. But I'd add another caveat, and Governor, maybe this will resonate with you, and maybe it won't. Being the president is a pretty big job. It's a pretty big job, to put it lightly. And I quite frankly don't see how you can be president effectively without going to the prayer closet every once in a while. I mean, the enormity of the decisions that you have to make. I mean, as the chief executive, I mean, you've got a cabinet, and so it means that most of the decisions that come to your desk are like, oh my God, decisions. You know, because you got a host of other people to handle everything else. And so I think, you know, it's kind of that intuitive, the predisposition, which also kind of feeds our comfort with this kind of symbiosis between politics and religion.
The thing that bothers me is the fact that religion is being used as a political weapon, and it is polarizing. Now, I know it hasn't always been that way, and it doesn't need necessarily to be that way. But from my point of view, that's the way it is today in this country. There's almost like a religious war going on, and I think that's harmful. And I think the question was a good one. Why do political people, they're almost obligated to express a personal faith or a personal belief system? And we are a pluralistic society. I don't know. I have very mixed feelings about that, because there's a part of me that says that ought not to be any kind of test. Now, if it's just simply a part of a biography so that people feel like they know the candidates and have some sense of their life experiences and so on, that's one thing. But to express a theological position as a way to try to win votes, I just find that troublesome.
Well, you know, look, democracy is messy.
It is.
And you know,
religion is messy.
That's right. That's precisely right. And so I think,
And the
you know,
combination is not even to be thought about.
you know, you multiply negative times with negative, you get a positive.
There we go. There we go.
But you know, it's okay to be uncomfortable sometimes as we practice our politics. You know, again, I don't think we can get away from it. And as an ordained United Methodist minister, I had a church for a while, but I'd still preach every once in a while. But you know, these roots, you know, run deep. You know, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. You know, on our currency in God. These roots are deep. I don't think we ought to run from them.
I understand that, preacher, but
okay.
There's a difference between ritual speech and policy speech.
Yes.
And I think we could find some ground at, okay, if this is ritual speech, let it go forward.
But
Policy speech is, I think, what's concerning you, and I think it concerns
But
many
I was
people.
in Congress, and I was sitting there as President Bush was being sworn in, and I believe it was Franklin Graham,
Sure.
who was, you know, praying. And as I recall, these may not be the exact words, but as I recall, he said, "In the name of Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord." And I'm thinking, he's praying for this nation. We are a pluralistic nation, and that's excluding a lot of people. And I just felt like that was not really appropriate.
But see, that's ritual speech, which you said should go forward.
Well, Rick Warren was the more recent one giving an invocation, so we haven't come that far from Franklin Graham in terms
But the
of
other point,
evangelicals.
I mean, a kind of counterpoint to this, you know, I'm a card-carrying Democrat, but when Bush, I was in South Africa when he gave his State of the Union address. I want to say it was 2000. It's his second or third. It's probably his second State of the Union address. And he talked about dealing with HIV/AIDS in Africa. And he actually departed from his script because I asked him about it. And he started to speak theologically about the obligation that a country as wealthy as ours, that we have an obligation to care for the least of those in our midst.
Right.
And he said that if we don't get out front in dealing with this issue of HIV, AIDS in Africa, God shame on us.
I remember that.
I
And
have
it was
no
by
problem
far,
with that.
it was by far the most far-reaching.
That's three Methodists in agreement. How
Yeah.
would there be?
Yeah.
But this whole discussion is really shows you the extent to which this is the use of religion and whether it is a positive or negative
Yeah.
is so much in the eye of the beholder. Because you talk about abolition, and I can tell you that, you know, when I interview people who are involved in the anti-abortion movement, they will call it a modern-day abolition movement. They will liken it also to ending a Holocaust. And in their view, that is, you know, that's the work that they're doing. It's good work. It's what Jesus would want, and it's righteous work. So I ask us all just to, you know, keep that in mind. So that was a great question. It kicked off a great discussion, but I want to go to another. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ignore you up in the balcony there, so your turn.
Hi, my name is Luke Scanlon. I'm actually Professor Parker's student, one of his classes. I'm looking forward to getting that A on my midterm, sir.
Is this
Let's hear what the question is.
Oh, the question. I'm getting back to that. Okay. So my name is Luke Scanlon. Sorry, I'm back. So I am the president of the Harvard Tea Party here. I'm from Texas. I am a student leader in the Tea Party group nationwide. And so I'm also an evangelical Christian, and having gone to church in the South and now come to church up north, there's a dramatic difference in views and how people perceive their faith and how the rhetoric is used in expressing that, not just in the church, but in just around. And so one of the things, to the governor's point, is, and I think Professor Parker clarified it well, is that are we dealing with a ritual discussion, or are we dealing with a political weapon almost? I don't want to view my faith as a political weapon. It's a personal belief that I have. So my question comes to, in politics, I think, Governor, your point is, is it a biography? Do I want to get to know somebody better? And if someone tells me where they believe, I feel much better about it.
And the question is?
The question is, I was getting to it. The question is, what can we do in our rhetoric in the media and publicly? How can we change our rhetoric to not make it such a polarizing, a branding weapon, and clean up the political argument? And I mean, not just on CNN, but even in forums like this and in schools like this. I mean, it's such a vibrant and searing topic. You go one way, someone in a direction that someone doesn't want to hear it, and all of a sudden, you know, you're demonized, and it's just really, really bad. I mean, how can we change that rhetoric as a country and accept, you know, who we are and who we're becoming?
Okay, good question. Mm-hmm.
I could answer that question and respond to that question in one or two ways. I mean, one, academically, suggests that we ought to take seriously the language of people like Ernst Troeltsch. And his book is classic, The Social Teachings of the Christian Church. But in the real world, that probably won't get us too far. I honestly think that this thing has got to run its course. I think the best thing to get us to a point where we've got a more civil debate and discussion, whether it's using religious language or secular language, is that Rick Santorum get the Republican nomination, and that he loses abysmally, and then you'll see a swing in the Republican Party back toward the center, much in the same way we saw in, and I won't say these are the moral equivalents, but I think politically, I think that there's an analogy here. But in '72, when we swung so far to the left in the Democratic Party and got trounced with McGovern as our standard bearer, we then started to move to find our way back to the center.
Why do I feel like that's not the answer you wanted to hear?
No,
not
it's
to
an
get
answer.
into a discussion, and we're going to.
But that is the
balcony
answer
here
that I
hasn't been
wanted
heard
to
at all. Yeah. All right. Fair enough.
And we
Okay.
can talk later if you'd like.
Yeah,
Please.
it's a good question.
Your turn.
My name is Thomas Frank. I'm a journalist from Austria, right now on a fellowship here in the States. I've got a question for the panel. What do you make of the fact that of the 3 Republican candidates in the primary, one is Mormon, and 2 are Catholics, and they're wooing for evangelical voters? Does that, I mean, what do you make of that fact? Does it mean that the differences between the religions are less important these days than what they have in common?
Question, who wants to take
I
that?
mean, I think that what matters in the Republican primary is where you are on these so-called moral or social issues, and it seems to be that it matters less what your actual denomination is. I think it's striking that someone like John McCain was nominated, who, as far as I can tell, is not religious at all. To the earlier question about all of our candidates and presidents being religious, I actually don't think that's true. I actually don't think President Obama is religious. He doesn't belong to a church, and he goes maybe once a month and never talks about it. So I actually think it's not the case that they're all religious or at least want to be perceived that way. But, you know, John McCain was not religious at all. I'm not even sure. I'm sure he's Protestant. I don't even know what his religion is. He's Episcopalian,
so
okay.
He may or may not be
right, so,
religious.
So I actually think what matters far more in the Republican primary is, you know, where you are on the issues than it is what your actual denomination is.
Okay.
I'd make a variant comment on that, which is the intensity of religious walls between denominations is much lower today than 50 years ago. Yes. Certainly much lower than 100 years ago in American political life. And I think her point is exactly the right one, that in these primaries where you have a subset of voters, it's the issues that are driving the choices, not the denominational affiliations. And the fact that we thought that being Mormon would disqualify Mitt Romney with evangelical voters, and what the results have been, I think, speak to exactly that.
My name is Amy Jeffrey, and I'm asking a question on behalf of the JFK Junior Forum Committee. As a lot of students in the audience are interested in pursuing politics in the future, what do you see as the role of religion and politics in future election cycles?
Well, I think that the role of religion changes constantly depending on where the country is. I mean, I made the point earlier that there have been 3 religious rights cycles in the 20th century, and this is at the very tail end. It may even be the echo back period from the 3rd cycle. And it'll depend, I think, a lot, importantly, on the fastest growing sector, you know, the fastest growing religious bloc in America today, which is the non-affiliated. One of the really interesting consequences of the great push of the white evangelical community in the 80s and 90s was based on a claim that they were growing dramatically. Well, the data doesn't suggest that they've grown at all as a share of total American population. They're about where they were at the start of this whole cycle. And the one group that has grown dramatically by 2 to 2.5 times are the non-affiliated. Now, a lot of them are coming from the mainline Protestant churches, but they're coming from all over. And there's good reason to believe that among young people in particular, the disaffiliation is because religion has been associated with this particular brand of politicized Christian evangelical conservatism. So what will happen in the next 20 years is going to be largely a function of how your generation and the next after it continues to make that judgment that religion means conservatism. And in particular, for younger women, that religion means conservatism about women's bodies in ways that women don't want to agree with. So
Can I just
I
add
think
to
that's
that,
huge.
that the other big change is immigration and the growing diversity of this country, and you have many people who either are coming here from very diverse religious backgrounds where the church or other religious institutions play a very different role in politics in those countries, and even the generation that's born here from those families have a very different relationship to the religious institutions they come from. So I imagine, you know, in 50 years that this could look like something, you know, we can't even imagine what it looks like, because the growing diversity of this country brings in a very different worldview about the role that religious institutions play.
My name is Rod, and I'm a volunteer with both the Occupy Boston movement and the Tea Party movement. And the Venn diagrams of those two movements overlap a lot more than the corporate media might lead you to believe. One of the more well-known alumni around here, Theodore Roosevelt, was famously described by someone as, quote, if you were to distill Theodore down to his essence, what you would eventually find is the militant church, or the church militant. And while discussion of social issues can be probably informed by religious understanding, the teachings of a church with good result, better than, again, corporate media often give it credit for. When Roosevelt was describing and advancing what he called the new nationalism, he was principally addressing the problems that are familiar to us of corporate parasitism, of corporatism run amok. And by the way, if there's anyone here who has not yet seen the documentary An Inside Job, please do. And do take careful notes and apply them to great letters to the editor, won't you?
So, your question is?
My question is, that is an application of Christian understanding, and not just by Roosevelt. And I'm wondering what you folks think are the prospects in this election for that understanding to be brought to bear meaningfully. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I think, first of all, I mean, Roosevelt, like his successor Woodrow Wilson, was riding the crest of the progressive era. The progressive era had been born out of the social gospel movement in the Protestant mainline churches in the late 19th century. And the fact that those presidents both were Protestant mainliners is representative of a time when white Protestantism of the mainline kind was politically dominant in the United States outside the South. That's no longer true. And so it's difficult to look back on a specifically Protestant social gospel, a mainline Protestant social gospel tradition as the possible source of a new iteration of that same kind of politics. Whether or not there is a foundation that draws on religious moral values, that draws from Catholic social justice, from Jewish justice traditions, as well as Protestant traditions in the social gospel movement, that's a different story. That's a different story. But it can't any longer look to mainline Protestantism to serve as the engine to drive that politics.
I mean, there may well be a critique of corporate America in this election, but it will come as a reaction, I think, to Citizens United and super PACs and the role that corporate donations play in policymaking. And you see that articulated somewhat by the president, though, as he gets more populist. He gets more populist as it gets closer to election day. But you see it at the state level, where you have a bunch of Republican governors, including in Ohio, where these corporate donors are playing a huge role in policymaking. I just don't know that it comes from necessarily a faith tradition, this critique, but I think it's quite possible it'll be a big part of this election.
I was going to ask a question off of this, which is there a religious left? Is religious left a factor at all, and who are they, and where do we see them visible?
I think they exist. I'm disappointed they're not more out front in terms of advocacy, but there is a religious left. It's pretty dormant, though, don't you think? Is that what you're finding with your polling?
Well, I just think that I mentioned earlier, there's an institutional problem with the religious left. So both at the level of their constituency, their churchgoers aren't as religious, if you will, as the churchgoers on the right. Mm-hmm. And so whether that's a source of bodies or donations or energy or communication networks, mobilization networks, it just don't have the infrastructure. So you have some very prominent people who talk about the budget is a moral document, and talk about social justice, and talk about caring for the poor, but you don't have the same institutional foundation for it. So it's very hard to have influence if you don't have kind of an institutional base. The labor movement is really the institutional base on the left, such as it is. I mean, it's obviously on the decline, but that's really the only base on the left. Mm-hmm.
Well, let me take issue at this point that you don't have the same sort of power at the denominational level that we saw during the social gospel era today. But having said that, you do have a vibrant prophetic tradition that is still alive. You see it in African American churches, in the urban areas around the country. And Laurie, I think you made the point earlier about the diminution of the Pat Robertson crowd,
the Christian Coalition.
Christian Coalition. Well, one of the things that's been that I found somewhat interesting.
I like the Pat Robinson crowd.
I knew what he was saying.
Is that you had some of those folks on the evangelical side, his name escapes me, but at the Saddleback Church.
Rick Warren.
Rick Warren.
Yeah.
Who
I remember things.
who started moving much more in keeping with a tradition reflective of Martin King in terms of his approach to some of these issues. You know, that the evangelical church, we have our issues around piety that we need to address and, the personal religious experience, but, the gospel calls us to stand with the oppressed. So, while it might not be completely above the radar, there are some things happening, which is why at points along the way, the president will show up in some churches as he moves around this country, as will the eventual Republican nominee.
The Occupy movement has its own chaplains. So,
Can
and
I
those
ask-
are, and for the most part,
can I
those
ask
are
a question?
religious left. Can we let these guys ask the questions?
Yeah, I want to ask a question, I don't even care who answers it.
Okay.
But this is a very interesting point that was made about the role of super PACs, and if some entity is going to discredit, corporate America and its dominance over the political conversation, that's where it'll come from. Given that we're talking about politics and religion, would we prefer that prophetic response to come from super PACs, or would we prefer it to come from the church?
Is that a loaded question?
Yeah.
It's not really a loaded question.
I don't know. I don't know.
It's very existential.
Not too many churches with that kind of money. All right.
Hello, my name is Matt Stolhansky, and my question is, I just want a little bit of clarity around what appears to be an apparent kind of incongruency between two themes that you've hit on tonight. The first is sort of the surprising truth, not to me, but I think to most, that the Republicans are actually, they don't really care that much about religious denomination affiliation, given John McCain and what looks to be the likely Republican nominee, Mitt Romney. And what appears to be another theme that's been hit on here, which is that the Republicans are the apparent religious party, or the apparent, theological party, even just suggesting the question of, like, is there even a religious left in the country? So my question is, how do you rectify that? Why aren't Republicans getting more credit for being a people, for being a party that chooses its nominees on the basis of their principles and not so much on the basis of their denomination or their faith?
Very interesting.
Part of it is that the positions that they take coming from those traditions are somewhat outside of the mainstream of the general electorate. So it's hard, if you go back to contraception, there is a consensus in this country about contraception, and you have a set of positions being articulated by the Republican primary candidates and other Republicans around the country that is, antithetical to that position. So I'm not sure how they would sort of get credit, even if it's coming from a place of piety and faith, when the positions that they take, at least on the social issues, with the exception of abortion, which really is different, I think, than whether it's LGBT issues or women's health, they're sort of at odds with where sort of the average American is.
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Samuel Odama. I'm affiliated with the Graduate School of Education. Growing up in Dallas, Texas, I used to listen to a radio show where it was said, politics determine how we live here on earth, religion determines how we live forever. And I thought that was very interesting. But tonight I want to point out that it strikes me that there's not a lot of conservative voice on the panel this evening. I understand that we're at Harvard. Just keep that in mind. But Governor Strickland, I want to ask, does not one's faith influence and inform their decision to serve and to enter public life?
Well, one's values do, and many people have their values rooted in their faith, but not everyone who has strong values has strong faith. The first speech I gave when I decided to run for governor, I called myself the Golden Rule Democrat. That's, has religious overtones, I guess, but, and just let me say this, I went to a Christian college where we prayed before every class. I went to a theological seminary that, that taught that the Bible was the inerrant Word of God. And so I'm not disrespectful of those who harbor those beliefs, but I do believe that this country is so diverse and so pluralistic that we've got to include all citizens. And when you're in political office or when you're seeking political office, it is my opinion that you should have an inclusive attitude and outreach to people who believe as you do or people who don't believe as you do. And so that's part of the answer to this young man's question up here, I think, is how can we diminish the hostility of the dialogue? And that's to show respect for the kind of diversity that exists within our country, and not, try to limit our definition of what's a good person and a bad person based on what it is that they believe.
Thank you.
My name is Daniel Feng. I'm another student in Professor Parker's class of religion and politics, and I've heard about the story, the unhypothetical 65-page paper on a hypothetical Mormon running for a president. I couldn't wait to see that paper myself, to read it. But knowing that Romney has been the front runner all the time, and knowing that Mormonism so far hasn't been an open issue yet. But we also know, at least I personally feel, that there's always a persistent resistance against Romney's nomination in the Republican. Now, my question is very point blank. Given everything else is equal, if Romney were not a Mormon, might he have already locked in his nomination by now?
That's an interesting question.
Very good question.
What do you think?
I think that if he weren't worshiping in the church of flip-flop, he would already have. I'm quite serious. Right. I think that the ability to tag him with the flip-flop accusation has done him more damage with these voters who tend to dislike variability on issues more than his Mormonism. But that's my read.
I agree, and I think that to Republican primary voters is an indicator that he's not conservative enough.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Circling back around.
This is actually a little. I'm sorry. My name is Zach Sullivan. I'm a first-year grad student here at the Kennedy School. This is actually a little bit of a follow-up to Daniel's question. One of the criticisms levied against Mitt Romney is that he can be very wooden. It cannot be really clear what he believes in. Do you think that if he was talking more openly about his faith, would that help him with this sense that he doesn't believe in anything, or are the risks still too great?
No, because the narrative structure of Mormonism is too unfamiliar to too many of his base voters. I mean, it would be very dangerous. Mormonism has a complex narrative structure that is grafted onto the complex narrative structures of the Old Testament and New Testament. Mm-hmm. The Old Testament and New Testament are complex narrative structures that have been around long enough that they don't look unfamiliar. Mm-hmm. The narrative structure of Mormonism, which emerges out of the early part of the 19th century and makes claims and has narratives that are just very unfamiliar and jarring, would just play havoc with his base vote. So no.
No, but he could talk about just being a faithful person
and
his faith in God, and to the question about the role that faith plays in entering into public life, without talking about the particulars of Mormon theology. And
he gave that speech in Texas.
He did, but it was a long time ago. I mean, he needs to give it again. I mean, it wasn't like last summer. I mean, it was well before all of his problems have emerged that I think relate to him being a flip-flopper, not consistent, not conservative. So that kind of speech given later might have helped him more.
That's probably right.
Okay. I'm going to take the moderator's privilege to ask you all a last question, which is, and we've hinted at it a little bit, about the growth, the most quickly growing sector are the nuns, and this is not Catholic nuns, these are N-O-N-E-S, the religiously unaffiliated, right? Not nuns and priests. You know, with in 10 years, I think, almost doubling, we're about at what, 15%?
Yeah, more than double, yeah.
And that's at the general population. If you look at you know, younger generations, it's even greater. Do you foresee a day when you know, we'll see a president who's we would elect a president who's an openly atheist? Will we get there?
I think we only have one self-identified atheist in the entire Congress of the United States of America. I think there are probably some closet atheists there.
You know them?
I doubt if it will happen in my lifetime, but I'm quite old, so. But I do believe that what has happened with the intermingling of religion and politics, so that it has become so politically divisive, has been not good for the politics, and I don't think it's been good for the church. I think the church has suffered, and maybe that's one of the reasons I'd be interested in your opinion, that there are more nuns now, because people have been turned off by what they have seen as a use of religious faith in ways that are unacceptable to them.
Right. It's very hard to grow up in a generation that thought of religious dialogue as being something that Abraham Heschel and John Courtney Murray and Reinhold Niebuhr carried out, that had a level of seriousness and a commitment to America as a pluralist civilization, and what passes now for that same discussion in America today. I think that's done enormous damage to America and to the adherence levels.
Putting on my political consultant hat, when I work with candidates, I work with plenty who they may not tell me they're atheists, but it's pretty clear that they are nuns. And what we try to do with them when they tell their story, what their narrative is, to have some defining moment, anecdote, story that indicates what their values are. And it can be a story that comes from, you know, something that has to do with the religious arena or not. And I think that those kinds of stories are going to become more and more. I mean, I think for, you know, President Obama, it was, you know, grassroots organizing was kind of the indicator of what his core values were, more so than, even though he gave his speech on his church and race, and there was a religious theme to it, I actually think that that's kind of was his story about where his values came from and how he came to have the priorities that he had. And I think you'll see more and more candidates and politicians who have kind of their story of how they came to have their values that doesn't come from a religious place. And there are plenty who are running for Congress, not running for president, but plenty running for other kinds of offices where there's almost no discussion of people's faith background.
I think that the potential for us to elect someone who's atheist or agnostic is very real. You know, now, will it happen in the next election cycle? Probably not. But for me, the more profound question, or should I say equally profound question, is when might we elect the first Muslim president? You know, I mean, you know, that's...
Some people believe we already have.
But,
yeah.
That's right.
But, you know, I mean, and I think to start to entertain that question seriously moves us very close to a point that was a text of your first campaign for governor when you called yourself the Golden Rule Democrat. That's not implicitly religious. It's explicitly religious. And you know the really great thing about it is that it's a principle that is at the root of every major religion. Every major religion and philosophical tradition has some articulation of the Golden Rule. And if we start to see that as the translucent thread that runs throughout, then we'll be at that place where we aspire to go, to which this young man inferred, and to which hopefully this discourse got us closer to appreciating and understanding.
Mm-hmm. Well, this was, I'm sorry to those of you who didn't get a chance to ask your questions. I'm sure they're good ones, but the ones we did hear were terrific, and this was really just a great discussion. I want to thank you all for well spent. You know, boy, that was really...